and welcome everyone to the Avalon podcast. We are here with our third episode in this series of shadow working conversations with Raven Alison, who is a psychoshamanic practitioner and a dream guide. And today's topic is following on our last session about the Faerie Accord Free for the Lions. And we're really going to zoom into Faerie, the Fae beings, and a collective shadow that is related to the Fae and a personal shadow that's related to the Fae. So even if you don't know anything about the Fae folk, who they are, what they are, how they related to us and our consciousness, stay tuned because we're going to explain all that and continue to give you tips on shadow working. So welcome, Alison, to the show. I'm really happy to have you here.
Thank you, Dea. Yeah, and I'm really excited to dive into this one, especially because the Fae is a hot topic. And just a reminder to those that are just joining us for the first time, we highly recommend getting your Book of Shadows, a journal, things that are going to help you kind of set this sacred space in order to receive. Because when we're talking about these deeper collective threads and how they interweave into the personal individual experience, it's really good idea for you to use whatever methods you need in order to connect to that heart resonant truth. And just a reminder, if you haven't gone and listened to any of our episodes, this is episode 3 in our series. So just kind of go back, check in with the dragon shadow, and then check in with what the Faerie Accord even is, so that you have a greater understanding, as opposed to like jumping ahead. Because as mentioned in our last episode, typically we wouldn't really advise being this compartmentalized. So you have to keep in mind that we are now taking a section of the Faerie Accord in the Fae component. And I just think that's relevant to mention, because otherwise it can get very confusing and you can think like very isolated in this, and it shouldn't be like that. It should be very intuitive, very flowing, and very much about you. So Dea, did you want to get us started with what the Fae even is in comparison to the Fairy and stuff like that?
Yes, of course. So as Raven very well articulated here, we are going to compartmentalize the Faerie Accord for the sake of supporting you in your shadow working process. But altogether, the Fae is, of course, part of the Faerie Accord, but in our collective consciousness, the Fae is a certain parts or experiences, such as the experience and relationship we have with magic, with our emotions. The Fae can represent enchantment, for example. The Fae can represent what is real and what isn't real, and the ability to imagine and have fascination and excitement, the creative force behind our ability to actually manifest new things and experiences. But we've repeated this word Fae quite a lot, so I just want to explain what we mean. So when we use the word Fae or Faerie, right, the Fae for us is a group of ancestral beings, and that's very important because this is how they are related to our mythogenetics, that they are ancestral beings. They're part of our myth, right? They are part of our Earth story at the very least, and they include the elves, in different pronunciation, elven beings, devas, dryads, nature spirits, the little people, the little folk like the brownies and the pixies and so on. Whilst Faerie, as in Faerea, or sometimes it's with a Y, is actually a reference to a place, the residence of the Fae folk, or an alternate dimension, alternate reality, if you prefer that analogy. So what is the Fae regards to the collective consciousness is our next big question, right? How does it relate to our experience? And I think I'd love to hear Raven's angle on this first, if you want to.
Yeah, it like It's a great question to ask, and I am excited to hear your more mythogenetic kind of resonant with it. But in the way that I experienced it, and I feel like we need to really kind of disclose this, and we're going to dive deeper into how you can identify this in yourself. But for me, the Fae soul consciousness as a collective experience and how it kind of interacts with the individual was very much in kind of like this hive communication, in this thread communication, in this integrational experience. And that did contain some distortion, which Dea and I will kind of go into how you can identify, as she mentioned, what's real, what's not real, how do we identify the enchantment versus, what the Fae are actually communicating to us. But for me, it was very much like an integrative experience that's perceived on the individual level through the different energetic bodies. And so that's where it can get kind of like interesting. But I used to, for those that did kind of come here from the Confessions of the Fae Soul podcast, I used to call it the Fae Soul stream. And I know Dea and I kind of differed with that because she was very much like everything that you consider like streamy and flowy is very much concrete and factual and this to me. So I'm just kind of mentioning that as a reflection where it can be something perceived quite differently because it is very experiential. But overall, I feel like the Fae soul consciousness as a collective contains every single energetic body. What I mean by that is that, like Dea said, if we go to an ancestral level in the spiritual, crown chakra, higher chakras, then we have the mental body and how we're experiencing images and how they interact with archetypes in our psyche. And then we have our emotional body of, maybe we're just, not visual people and we're intuitively feeling and sensing and picking up on these experiences. And then we have the physical reality. And in my opinion, and I would be curious of your opinion on this, Dea, the physical reality with the Faerie and the Fae will be more accessible and more tangible and more physical the more the other layers are integrated. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah,
but that
sure.
to me is kind of how we bring them to life here, is by acknowledging them at the other levels.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah. So do you want to explain your side of that?
So for me, the Fae in the collective consciousness is very much connectedness. It's relationships. That is the frequency, if you like, and the vibration of the Fae. And a lot of the sort of new spiritual beliefs and ideals and ideologies, like the concept of oneness and how we are all much alike and we are all connected and we are all interwoven within each other and with the earth and with nature and other realms and realities, that so the multidimensionality is very much what Fae consciousness is that constant interwoven connectedness, and they act almost like adversaries for us between the unseen world that is the living beating heart of Gaia and living beating heart of everyone simultaneously, like adversaries between nature, human, and Fae itself. And therefore, one of the key elements of collective Fae consciousness is relationships, and the right kind of relationships. So when we mostly focus on shadow working, right, this is what the free Fae aspect brings to us. And everyone has an inner Fae, and I do hold the belief, you're right, I do hold the belief that we have exterior cognition. So we have these remembrances, experiences, this Fae consciousness exists within us because we had actual physical experiences with Fae beings. So I don't consider them purely archetypal. I consider them more of an ancestral story, more of a long forgotten history. And even the way we relate to Fae folk, if we compare them to other mythical beings, it's only Fae beings that we kind of consider part of a fairy tale, which is even lesser than a myth in a way, right? But other mythological creatures, we are happy to accept and integrate into our reality in a different way. So as a, collective, for an average person, the Fae shows up in their relationship, and then we can look at how we relate to, of course, one another, human to human, how we relate to the Fae, what relationships do we build, how we show up to our spirituality, right? How we show up to what magic means to us. Magic is energy, it's energy in motion, it's emotion. So how we show up to our emotional bodies, and how we are informed through the mental body and experience the Fae through the emotional body. And then we can expand on that and say, okay, how we relate to the natural world, that which we are part of and they are part of.
Yeah, that's a really great, yeah, it's a great way of looking at it. And hopefully that makes sense for people that are integrating. And just because they're, as a shadow worker, I'm always going to have that kind of more mental body archetypal language. And I guess I just kind of want to speak to that because what Dea has articulated, in my opinion, is accurate. So we can't really look at them as archetypal because they are not. They're beings. They're real, tangible, just like you and I and everything else. But what happens is that in the mind and in our stories and in that kind of distortion part of it, then images like Tinkerbell or Ariel or little things like that, they're actually, they're so sneaky in the way that they're collective symbols, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they just get inside the mind. So that's why if you're kind of new to this and you're just coming in, as opposed to somebody that's, been to Avalon Academy and is like right in it and understands all of this stuff, and you're already like a seasoned, Fae being, then, somebody just coming in without realizing, you might kind of be blocking yourself from the experience or have a hard time. And I know that I have in my past, I had a really hard time believing in fairies and the creatures and all the different beings, even though I would journey to the other world as a shamanic practitioner. I still had a really hard time with the fairies specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that was because of how those symbols and characters and motifs kind of hijack the mind aspect.
So
and I just think it's relevant to mention, right?
Yeah, that's something actually I think is really important to go into that experience, because I think a lot of people have at least come from that place, if not still there. So when I said exterior cognition, I mean that how we perceive fairy as beings and the world and the fae within us is through the mind, through images of the mind, and then that informs our emotional body, right? So mental body first, then emotional body. And so we relate to the fae through our ability to create, use our visioning, our inner eye, our imagination, right, to create images in our mind. So we can exist in a certain disbelief, and that's of course a program, right? That is what's not real, is that we can exist in a belief that fae folk only belongs to the fairy tales. They call the fairy tales for a reason, right? And so everything that we label as a fairy tale is just a story. But then when we look at shadow work and archetypal work and all the things that we do together, we know that the story is never just a story. Actually, story is at the core and center of everything, right? So moving away from that perception, then how we going to experience the fae, we will receive images and experiences, whether they're visual, emotional, or physical, depending on how you perceive the world. We're all different in that respect, based on what we already have to work with. So, for example, a very creative, artistic person, a painter, a dancer, will have a very vivid, very colorful, beautiful experience when they see the fae and experience the fae, or when they see the world of fairy and experience fairy, because they they have that open channel of magic, right? Energy, emotion, that ability to imagine. And that is actually the fairy medicine, right? That the Fae brings to us is this element of imagination that helps us to create, because without this, we would not come up with new ideas, right? So all the creators of the world, or the artists, the visionaries, the the individuals who dream up new things, right? That's fairy medicine, because they have to use their imagination, and those two first appear usually in the dream, and then in the mind, then they put emotion behind it, and then they manifest it physically. Right, so that's very important that we understand that believing or not believing from the Fae perspective is irrelevant, because they exist regardless, and they're not Santa Claus, basically. So they exist regardless of your belief, but you will have an experience that you've supplied data for. So we can look at the medieval time, which I think is a good information to mention, especially because my background is mostly in Irish fairy folk, and we have this whole medieval, even Edwardian era, where the Fae folk is feared, and there is religious conditioning to not to relate to the Fae whatsoever, if at all. And those accounts from that times often recite negative experiences with the Fae that are frightening or dark, and then go into stories of abductions and disappearances and punishments and so on. But that actually stems from what's already within us, within our mental body and emotional body, that we harbor an image, an imagination of fear, a belief of fear, a sort of dark perception, and so they will appear through that dark perception. So how you experience the Fae, both as a being and both in the collective, very much depends on how imaginative and creative you are as an individual.
Yeah, and how you're perceiving, like what Dea just said. So, and thank you for bringing that up about the darker aspects. So again, let's just reiterate, story is the medicine, story is the core, story is how we are, not to sound like negative, but that's how we're controlled, and that's how we can also reclaim our own power and like integrate those things. So I just feel like I see that so much in the way that the fairy and the fae are described collectively right now.
Yeah.
There's tons of positive, beautiful artists come to mind where they're just flowing. You see it. They're doing exactly what Dea just articulated. They're envisioning, they're getting images, the fairy, the fae, the elves, everybody is communicating. They're on the same page. And then they're, creating that into an art form, into an embodiment, into some kind of medicine. But then on the other side, we have people that are leaving offerings for the fairy and things like that, but maybe out of that place of fear, or they get like this kind of, and I even see people kind of like really advocating for the fae, but like in this negative way where they're like, oh, they're gonna, hurt you or do this, or like they're not very nice. And we'll go, I think I'll get Dea's opinion on this too, but like at a core, you cannot hold them to the same moral compass as humanity, because it's not even comparable. So just let that sink in, like literally take a breath. It's not comparable.
Yeah.
Breathe that in, because it's not a good or bad or anything according to humanity. It's like there's a right relationship, like we keep circulating back to, where it might take a while for you to kind of get into that flow or figure out how you're going to communicate. And if it's not in alignment, it won't ground into reality. Is that like resonate?
The lot of those examples that you have given are actually, stories regurgitated where, the myth of the Fae is really, is not really by the Fae, by the human experiencing the Fae beings and its hostility, right? There is countless stories of such. So we're talking about sort of traditional Celtic European myth, predominantly not Disney and all the modern fairy tales, which are the illusion, or that's how actually AI uses the fairy tales. But we're going to that later on when we get to what's not real. So a lot of those, when you relate to yourself, right, your inner fae, and then you will express that outwardly, that could be very visible or absolutely not visible. But the point is, how is the relationship, yet again, that you nurture with the fae, with the place and the beings? And the best way to relate to the fae is through the green world, is through nature, is through the trees, the plants, and the 5 elements, certain metals, for example, and the combination of these, right? So when you relate to the fae, and then you become a sort of interwoven with nature, then you begin to receive revelations and start to understand that sometimes you would express your emotions in a certain way because they come from what we call the hive mind. So what I mentioned earlier, the Fae are part of this perpetual oneness, and they interwoven in it. They're not just looking from the outside into it. A lot of Fae beings, not all of them, but a lot of them do have a hive mind. So information is freely shared. Basically, that's what it means. And perhaps emotions and thoughts are also perpetuated equally. So if you are interacting with one specific Fae being, spirit, whether it's a water deva, a mer being, or forest Fae, the rest of the hive, if that being is part of the hive, will receive that information too, right? So you're interacting with an entire world, right? And if you learn the sort of mannerisms of this relationship, that has a tremendous wisdom in it, and that can be applied to your human relationships as well, because we're not in that different. And that's something I really wanted to say, that when we're talking about you as Fae, everyone has an inner Fae, right? Just genetically, mythically, historically, if you trace your lineage back, I guarantee you will land at a place, at a tribe where there is a story about Fae beings. They might not be called Fae, they might not be called elves or elven beings, but yet again, when they described, you'll realize that, oh, actually, they are indeed. And then, of course, the way we use the word Fae today, we create new myths, and some of them is far from reality, right? So we wanted to talk about how the Fae is used, for example, for gender fluidity, right?
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of just highlight a couple of threads. I
Go.
love this. I love how Dea and I flow like that. I'm like, okay, we'll just anchor this here. But so the hive mind, which we'll get into later, but on the actual fairy, so not distortion, not mastermind stuff, but on the actual, the way that the fairy, as the fairy land, as that full communication happens. This is why I just want to reiterate again, if you've never done this, get to the trees. They're in the wood wide web. They are quite a similar communication style. And then that helps kind of hit that home. So if you already have a great connection with trees, let that kind of expand what Dea just said in your mind and understanding. It's like, oh, if I'm developing a relationship with this Fae being or this mer being or whatever, that is actually going to be rippling out. Not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, especially if they're connected to a queen.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so there's that. And then also in the way that story works and the way that this is why, you know, if we follow that thread that Dea so kindly provided, and we all kind of land at our innermost Fae being, where it is in our blood lineage, what kind of stories are attached to that. For myself, you know, in the water, I had to really integrate a lot of water mythogenetics and things like that. Whereas on the surface, my original fairy being was kind of manifested more of the forest and the trees. So sometimes it also isn't necessarily where you're at right now. you have to kind of really go deep and figure out where, you know, the stories are interacting with you. But with that being said, what happens is they tend to layer and they layer. That's how Disney kind of gets you, because it's sitting over top of the really juicy core. So you never really understand. And hopefully this is like making sense and I'm not taking you too deep here. But we have to kind of understand that layering process, I feel, in order to understand gender. So we don't want to dive too deep into this because we just want to make sure that people understand Fae is used as a pronoun to this day, you know, and we're not knocking that or anything else like that. But in my experience, because of that, because it was originally used as like a reclaim, from my understanding of how it was used as a gender pronoun. It was trying to reclaim derogatory terms, and Faerie being used as a derogatory slang. So then it was an empowering form for others to identify as. But like the Faerie themselves are gendered. And then if we want to go to an archetypal language, so inside the mind, stories, characters, symbols, motifs that are interacting with us, whether we're conscious of them or not in the collective shadow, it is gendered. Why? Because of that layering in the stories, right? There's definitely a man and a woman inside the mind and the mind alone. And for that reason, and in my own experience, because I had big gender woundings, the Fae are a beautiful method of helping you to like reflect and project and integrate your own inner man and woman, in my opinion. It's definitely worth looking into your inner opposite, and regardless of how you're identifying.
Yeah.
But we just kind of wanted, I don't know if I like articulated that properly, Dea, but like we just kind of wanted to articulate that the fairies are definitely in a gender. And I think you wanted to talk about the era that kind of got like maybe confused in story.
Yes, it's so you know, history is sometimes good to know, just for curiosity's sake. But the word fairy was, yes, it was derogatory term. It comes from the Edwardian era, even maybe earlier than that. And it was predominantly used to label men who dressed as women at the time, which was something that was sort of a curious new thing, or renewed thing at the time, right? The way people would witness that, and that was kind of a derogatory term for those specific individuals, and it was used as a tool of bullying, which is obviously, that's the first mistake there, right? Because that also already stems from ignorance. And then to reclaim that word as an identity makes sense, because there is this perception that the Fae are obviously non-gendered, right? But what really truly happens is they don't express in gendered appearances. So what I mean by that is, although there is definitely female and male Fae, they don't think or have a need to appear as either or, which is why when those who did have fairy encounters, those who are fairy artists, and bring these images through for us, or, you know, tell the tale themselves, often describe a being that is masculine with feminine features, or feminine with masculine features. Both exist, right? Because it's us humans, we kind of been locked into this way of thinking, this paradigm of, oh, okay, I have to appear the way I'm gendered, whilst that doesn't really exist in fairy, and they don't think like that, and the appearance is actually chosen based on fascination. So the way they appear and the way they take form and shape is actually based on what they are passionate, fascinated, and excited about. So if they're really into the long hair, you're going to have a lot of long hair fairies. If they change that, then it's going to change. So you know, just to give you like very small sort of refined examples of what could happen. Yeah, so that's again a way we've started to use these terms today, and historically that's kind of what happened. But the Fae exist upon the planet of the Earth for a long, long time. They're one of our founder races, one of our elder races, and that is why it is so layered, as Raven said, because it's so much story upon story and upon story, and some of them is real and some of them isn't. So our idea for this recording was actually to sort of look at okay, what is real? Because that is actually what Fae consciousness is a reality, a perception, an experience. So at the stage of imagination, when we have an idea and we imagine it, it's real. But we perceive that only what is manifested physically, which is the next later steps, is real, right? So actually, Fae consciousness has a lot to do with reality. So in terms of relating to the Fae, we can look at, okay, what is real? Connecting to the Fae relationship and making offerings that are in alignment with the earth and the Faerie accord. So if we do have Faerie connections and we still don't really think about the exchanges we make, whether that offering is an energy exchange or a physical object, right? How conscious are we? And an example that I wanted to bring in here, and we both spoke about this, is dried plants, dried herbs, and cut flowers, right? So the idea of it, an offering made to a Fae being, is to sort of tell a story, have an energy exchange. So if we provide from our side already dead things, because that's what a cut flower is, it's something that is dying. We are essentially offering a sort of slowed down process of death as an exchange. It is not appropriately received because it's not really thought through. Same with dried herbs and plants. So sometimes, modern spirituality has a certain approach to exchange of energy and offerings that is a little bit removed from how Faerie spirituality would be. Or, what is real from a Faerie perspective could be what feels good in the body. And that was actually something you said, Raven, that what determines for you what's real, right, is how it feels in the body.
Yeah, well, that's because I spent a lot of time with things that didn't feel great in my body. But yeah, then I really love that we're talking about the offerings and everything else. And we talked a lot about this in the last episode with the Faerie Accord and kind of living in that alignment. So we can just bring it home there. So if you're already like, oh no, what do I do? Just breathe into that inner agreement, and kind of have that as an intention and actually think about it. Because if your offering is not in alignment with the earth, then that's where my kind of goes like, okay, this isn't real. And when something feels good in our body, and Dea, I think, really reflected this at me, not sexually. So yes, it can feel powerful and we can be, channeling our life force, of course, but it shouldn't just feel like an erotic kind of, that to me is kind of maybe has a kinked energy as a shadow worker, which is something that we might want to explore deeper within ourselves. But it's more feeling good in the body, as in, oh, this resonates. This feels in alignment with what I'm doing. I see so many people, for those that don't know, my actual schooling background is in fish and wildlife biology and environmental science. So I all the time am trying to, especially if I share something on the screen, I'm trying to really show and articulate, and I know Dea is the same way, of like what we're actually doing, because even when you're harvesting flowers or things like that, like all the time I see so many people where they have these beautiful friggin' offerings of all these flowers, all these things. 9 times out of 10, those species are not native to the environment. What does that mean? That means that they do not occur there naturally. So even though they're cut, they're dead and whatever, and then so already you're disrespecting the Fae, then on the earth level, you're actually disrespecting the earth, because a seed could grow there and then all of a sudden you have a problem. We just have to kind of really get clear And in a lot of cases, you know, if offerings aren't working or things like that, I know like Dea was saying that she's like, if the brownies are stealing your stuff, maybe they don't like what you're offering, right? And so we have to kind of trial and error, right? And how we
Sure.
learn is through that process. So don't judge yourself. You know, Dea and I have both like made little, you know, mistakes, or if you want to
Oh, yeah.
call them that, or learning experiences through our offerings, and then you get the feedback in reality, and it's not there. Another cool thing about just kind of going off of offerings, but also what Dea was articulating, is that once something is real, it has a beautiful physical manifestation in reality that like inspires or serves a greater purpose. Your offerings can really be like that. They can actually start being a deeper story. They can start being in right relationship, and it can start being like a back and forth. Like a lot of times I've, you know, even cleaning up the beach, like if you pick up litter and then all of a sudden you're receiving a shell, then you can use those shells or things as an example in a ritual. But then like you go and you take that back and do like a sacred offering. Yes, you're like returning those items there, but you know, maybe you've infused it with like your own spell for the fairies or things like that. I have like done enchantment with the fae as an exchange, especially when I was writing wrong steps that I had
Mhm.
taken in relation, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Or the other thing I really love is when we reclaim certain items and objects, and they're often bones, for example, that were meant for a completely different purpose. Even littering, right? Even items that were meant to eventually be litter, we can reclaim them and use them for a sacred purpose, right? But in order to sort of, when it comes to offering and making these energetic exchanges with the fae, we're doing them to build a relationship, right? And the way you determine what is the right exchange of energy is to communicate within that relationship, ask questions, find out what's right, what's wrong, find what is desired, you know, what are, first of all, be honest about your desires, and then reciprocity will then let you know what are their desires, what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate. It's not always decided by, you know, it's not on a list that is ticked all the boxes. It's more about the specific being, the specific place you're at, the relationship, the nature of the relationship you may be nurturing. And we are always in relationship with the fae. Not all of them are direct and have a form and necessarily sort of fully conscious, but we are always relating. So, you know, it's just zooming in and having these awarenesses. And I think one of the most beautiful exchanges are actually not objects at all. They are acts, as Raven said. They are acts toward, whether it's preserving the environment or cleaning up or artistic expression. It can be an exchange, an offering. And that is why, you know, one of the most beautiful fairy gifts that this world has is art. It's art in every form that you see it that comes from fairy. That's fairy medicine. And then have a look at how little art is valued sometimes, you know, in our lives. And then you can see how the relationship is with fairy, truly. And then also artistic expression can be an offering: dance, song, poetry. For the painters, you know, their relationship informs the art, but then the finished manifested product, becomes the offering. So there's a lot that, you know, we can do to bring fairy medicine to this world, um, through our artistic expression. But then,
Mm.
of course, we've looked at, you know, these are the things that we know are real. And what you said about, you know, sometimes we discern reality based on how it feels in the body. And if you're kinesthetic, that's very good. It's important that we listen to our intuition, but sometimes those physical responses are, as you said, a kink, right? They are almost like an arousal, right? And there is so much going on right now in the world that relates elven beings, mostly more than fae, but both, to erotic kink, right? And the problem I have with that is that it's subjecting them to erotic kink, right? So it's not an informed consented relationship, it's a fantasy. So the other nature of the consciousness of the Fae is the enchantment, it's the fantasy, is when the images and ideas run wild and they are never grounded in reality, and they can take us on what I call a side quest, right? When we come off the road, we're no longer authentically relating. We're actually not creating anything. We're just, mingling, right? And getting lost in our own story. And the internal is not expressed to the external, sorry, at all. It is not expressed outwardly. It is not reciprocated. It's not a communication anymore. It's just happening within you, and you have no impact. When you're lost in a fantasy, you are gone from this world and Faerie simultaneously.
Yeah, thank you, Dea. And so one thing I just want to say is what Dea and I are doing right now is also an offering to the Faerie.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even your words, you're speaking up about them, like what we're doing right now, and kind of, both of us have communicated with them, set the intention, what needs to be said, and this was one of them. So we really wanted to kind of go over what is real, what's not. So I just kind of wanted to highlight a couple of things as a shadow worker. Number one, erotic kinks and fantasies, everybody has them, and that is okay. So there's absolutely no shame. There's no nothing. But there's a couple of things that I have found effective in how you can integrate this. The same with the gender. So I kind of just want to highlight that again as how we are integrating that, regardless of how we identify. So regardless of what our fantasy is, regardless of those types of things, what you can do is you can actually look at what the fantasy is. So for me, I totally wanted like a beast, pan kind of energy. You know what I mean? There's nothing wrong with that. I totally, love that. But or even like a dragon, when I had the dragon in more of the creature form, so what is that at a core as an example? That's me kind of like disrespecting my own consciousness if I'm integrating the dragon in myself, right? So we kind of have to look at everything, not everything, but like in the Faerie, because it is reflecting back in this intuitive channel of reality, like Dea has said this entire episode. So we have to get into this place of a neutral observer, of not judging these parts of ourselves, but then actually look at them to integrate. So we can be, it's not like, oh, I shouldn't sexualize the Elven Fae. It's more like getting clear on where that energy is coming from.
Yeah.
And maybe then you take that on instead of projecting it out onto them. What do I mean by that? Maybe you want to wear lingerie over your shirt like I am right now, because that makes me feel erotically empowered in my business persona. And that's what the Faerie showed me in my reflection, so that I don't have to sexualize them. That's one example. Another thing we can do is we can, because this is tying into kind of what Dea and I want to articulate as well. When something is not grounded and it's just existing in the dream or in the fantasy or in this,
exactly,
then what happens is that we're not really taking that on ourselves. We're projecting it out, or we're looping, because that's what a kink is. It's not just sexual. What a kink actually is that your energy is looping, and it gets kind of stuck because it's an unconscious thing, and it creates a buildup, and then it has a release. And I just kind of want to articulate this, because yes, we can have that with our sexual fantasies, but that's what happens in the Fae soul, Fae fog, as we call it. It's an actual energetic kink, but it's happening in the dreamer, in the imagination, in the escapism, in the dissociation. And if that is not rooted and grounded in a functional, foundational energy, then there is going to be a big collapse, which we mentioned in the Dragon Shadow episode.
Exactly. I think we spoke about this in the Dragon Shadow episode, but I think, so personally, I really feel that like imagination, fantasy, even our ability to dream up you know, whether they are erotic things or not, is a beautiful skill. It's a talent, and it's medicine. The difficulty arises from when we stay in that stage and we're not proceeding into, okay, how does that ground into this reality? Because we are physically in this reality, and our core, our center is human. So at some stage of that journey, that relating, that experience, that has to ground into reality, right? It has to take a form, right? And if the fantasy doesn't take form, as Raven said, it's looping. So you're not going anywhere, and you are getting deeper and deeper into a place where you forget who you are, forget your purpose, and it's a journey to come back from that. And people do, right? They come away from that, they come out of the fog, and that is what we refer to as humbling, I think, in that episode, right? When you come back and then you sort of realize, and there's always learning as well. You always receive medicine there, but you realize what's true and real for you, and what could be grounded into this reality and what cannot be grounded in this reality. And a lot of people do use Fae and Elven archetypes, connections, beings, and the world and how they relate to it as a form of escapism, because there is, that world is actually pain-free, which is really appealing. Because if it's a world of no suffering, then of course, from a world where suffering is an existing reality, we would very much like to opt out. And I can totally relate to that, because I've been there as well. And I think most of us have at some point of their life, even if they didn't realize that that is actually Fae folk related. So we want to be there, we want to live there, we want to act like that, but then we're not honoring the medicine of that place, and we're not grounding what we received into this reality. And how does grounding it into this reality looks like? Comes through your expression. It's a cycle of manifestation. You go through the dreaming, the imagining, the fantasizing, and then you gotta gestate it, and then you gotta birth it. And that is individual. That it really much depends on what it is, right? And how it looks and what you imagined. There is always a way to bring that medicine into this world physically, but it might not look exactly the same as it looked in relation to Faerie.
Yeah. And I think we also wanted to talk about the external versus the internal.
Yeah.
Really want to talk about that, because Dea's kind of articulating this. It's an escapism, it is pain-free, but once you ground, the pain is there, let me assure you.
Oh yeah.
We've all seen it and we have experienced it. But basically we want to kind of like help you. So this is like why we're doing this, right? We want to help you, not scare you. So there's a couple of things that we want to highlight. Number one is the internal reality of your integrated, Fae versus external. So external unalignment stuff could be perceived as Faerie core without having, so we're not knocking that at all. But I think the expression that we wrote down was like, if the external actions don't match the outfit, then that is not real, because that's you putting on a costume or a persona or whatever. And like, you're taking a picture with a tree and in your Fae outfit and all this stuff, but then you're not honoring that relationship and developing that relationship and getting clear and doing the deep shadow work that's necessary for these relationships to thrive. Another thing is, let's talk about the Fae fog. I think it's important to mention, and I think we need to identify that, because there's a couple of ways that we can identify that people are like kind of, I guess, washed away in that, or if you yourself are. So number one, if people are in what we're kind of labeling this Fae fog, or this kind of AI mastermind hive Faerie consciousness that isn't rooted in earth or reality. So it's only a fantasy, it's an enchantment, it's an illusion. We've already kind of set that up. So if you're looping in your own story, right? You're looping in your own story, you're going nowhere fast. how can you identify that? You're going to kind of be feeling, and we see it in people on the screen, you're going to be under the illusion that everybody needs to know like the wisdom that you're sharing. Now, people need to know your wisdom that you're sharing. And this is very important. And it's going to kind of like, if you're also stuck there, you're going to, or maybe just gone, it's going to look very robotic. It looks like robotic light. So again, I am not judging. Like, you really have to receive my words as this neutral observer. So I have no judgment. I was lost in the dream for years of my life because I got enchanted with the Fae. But if somebody's really gone, it's going to look really beautiful on the surface. But again, those core things, they're not going to be in alignment with the lands that they're on. They're not going to be integrating their blood lineage or real stories or things like that. And they're not going to be sharing information that actually is in alignment with the other episodes that we have already discussed in the Faerie Accord and all those things. Yeah. So those are some things you can check. Number two, it looks like, another thing it looks like is people look like they are integrating madness or psychosis. Why? Because they're coming out of that kink that they just looped around for however long. So that has to unravel and unwind karmically. They have to essentially walk their own karma and ground the dream and the vision that did not have a solid foundation. So all we can do for those people, and it's going to look very beautiful. It'll look, and I've seen it in myself, I've seen it in others. It looks basically like on one side of the equation, it's going to be beautiful Fae soul medicine, grounding out of their words, actions, things like that. Most often it manifests like that other person that thinks they're, and like, I'm, for those that are like listening to this, I'm doing my classic like animal no heart. I call it the no heart because it's an animal operating with the mind. Mm-hmm. And the reason why there's no heart is because we weren't paying attention. We were getting lost in the dream. And so the heart actually wasn't grounded in tangible reality. So it's going to look like a painful experience of somebody that is trying to figure it out. They're actually kind of going insane or possibly like showing signs of psychosis. And all we can do, in my opinion, and my own experience of grounding my own fairy nightmare / dream, is we compassionately hold space. And if you allow them to kind of unravel, it will work out. You don't have to save or rescue anybody, but just be very compassionate that that is what's happening. And if they are in alignment to reflect with you, you can actually help them ground that medicine more tangibly. And Dea, I would love you to kind of like just ground what I just said, because I feel like I'm one that kind of came out of my own descent through the madness, I guess, of the Fae bomb.
Yeah. No, that makes it makes perfect sense, darling. I think so I'd like to approach this as kind of from my experience and perspective of the fairy healer or the fairy woman, for someone who do see and work with people who get lost in the Fae fog, or we call it wandering in the mist, right? So there's this analogy of trying to get to Avalon, which is the fairy kingdom, but you get lost in the mist and you never find your way home. And then so you're sort of lost to this world, right? You're lost to our world here, because we cannot see or feel you anymore. So those that are in the fog, they will not realize that, right? But there is a part of their consciousness that is already looking for the way out, but the surface, the visible part, the expressed part is living the story that is happening in the fog. Is usually very beautiful as an expression of themselves, right? It's going to be an identity, it's going to be a mask. And yes, it is a mask, and it's a persona that mimics. So this is how you know that AI is involved, because AI copies a lot, right? It's artificially, it's intelligent, it's smart, but it's artificial, so it copies, right? So it's going to be a lot of mimicking. So you're going to put these people you can put next to each other, and it's like, wow, I can't even tell them apart because they are actually all in the same fog. But what you do and what does help, if you ever come across it, or you have a suspicion that you've been there, and most human beings have, by the way, these are not super unusual scenarios, even though they might sound like it, is validate it. So what I often do is, and this is a belief that sort of we fairy women hold, that if someone expresses that they are something, and it makes very big I am statements of I am this and I'm that, and this is what I'm doing, and this is my purpose, and look how authentic I am, look how good I am, we validate it. Because what is truly happening is that person is looking for their heart, and they truly are everything they say, just not right now. So they are actually going to be that. That's their journey. That's where they're going. That's their evolution, right? Just at this moment, they're not there yet. So obviously they're grasping for that image, that experience. So the authentic version of what they're expressing is there in a future timeline. So you sort of welcome them as, you know, their expression at the moment, at the time. It's absolutely no point pointing out where they're wrong. It's really no point expressing any of your concerns, you know, because when they don't see it and you act as a mirror and they see themselves, you're most likely just going to get projection. That's not helpful, right? So what we want to do is hold space, as Raven said, for that journey. And there is going to come a time when they are sort of walking out and away from the fog, at which point a good fairy healer will employ certain techniques and methods and bring in certain elements that help. And there's two symbols that I want to give people today to use if you suspect that someone is on their journey out of the fog, or is coming out. And yes, it does look like madness at that stage, could be, or just confusion, or just I don't know what to do with my life, I don't know who I am anymore. So identity crisis, right? There's two sort of fairy medicine. One of them is iron. Iron cuts the cord with the illusionary world. So you want to be able to use iron either as a symbol or as a metal to separate that world and this world. So it grounds the body, right? Iron actually keeps us on the surface of the earth, even from a scientific perspective. So it brings us back to this and the here and the now, and that has to be timed well. It doesn't always work. And the other is to cross a stream of water, right? In mythical storylines, when you want to get away from fairy, you've got to jump across a stream or a river of water. You have to step across water. So mimic that in a physical reality. Guide these people through a river, walk them through water. And walking through water also means walking through the flow of emotion. So talk and walk and experience, go through the experience of what it feels like, right? So let's zoom their focus from the identity and the story itself to what it feels like. So what happens is, as you walk through water, as you walk through the emotions, you find, and well, they find their heart.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And yeah, for those that like don't know, that's how we met. We met with me coming out of the Fae fog, and it's been really beautiful, and grateful for our, you know, our friendship and everything. Get a little like sappy on the podcast episode, but it was absolutely beautiful. And I think that what she is, you know, reiterating is very important. And not even just at the fairy level, at a psychological level, there is a lot of power that we can give back to somebody by accepting their reality, and whatever it is, as long as it's not hurting you or them, then, you know, validating that and holding them in that reality helps them remember, as Dea is so kindly articulated. And another thing that, and maybe I'll even dive deeper into this on the next creature one, but another gift of an ally that really helped me and that I would love to reflect to you, that is connected to the Fae, are the ravens. if you ever want to call in some beautiful karmic detanglers, do a journey with an offering to the ravens. Or, they're connected to Morgana and the Morgan and, just, well, and Braun. And yeah, like they're just so beautiful to work with, and they help. They're just really good at detangling karmic narratives and stories. So if you kind of feel like that, or if you have friends like that, then you can definitely start working with the ravens, and they can really help you kind of come out of that. And they definitely help me with that.
So
and
that's
hopefully we didn't scare people.
well, even if
like,
we did, that's just how it is, guys. And this journey that we kind of described is actually a journey of becoming a medicine person, by the way. Going on a quest, looking for answers, looking for more, looking for another world, solutions, pain-free places, then getting lost, then finding your way back, then going through this almost like this death and rebirth process, going through the sacred madness, and then landing, hopefully, with something that we can consider medicine, that is healing, that is transformational, that is your own at the end of the journey, that which you can either keep and exchange with your immediate environment or share with the world. That's a choice that needs to be made later. But that is kind of an initiatory journey. And I do think everyone goes through that. I just don't think everyone is willing to complete it because it's not easy. And yes, so the creature we will go into our next episode is going to be all about the creature, because the creature is the physical part of, in a way, a physical grounding part of the Faerie Accord. Whilst the Fae was all about, we talked about the emotional body, the mental body, imagination, the unseen world that exists and woven into everything. The creature is very much the seen world, right? So they do offer a transitional medicine, but if you want to work with Fae allies and Fae guides, in the fog, outside of the fog, either way, I think co-walkers who are ex-humans, right, are very helpful. So you might not want to go align yourself with a very ancient Fae being, but might want to do sort of build this relationship with for example, Merlin is an ex-human. Taliesin is an ex-human. Characters that existed in the past or exist in the present that walk Faerie, but they either are human souls in Faerie or actually have physical bodies here, even better, right? So those individuals could be just helpful guides for, at the very least, this sort of questing, lost and confused stage of the journey.
And just like really, ask yourself, what does my Fae need, or how does it express? Or, a lot of times, especially when we're receiving all of this information, we really do have all the answers inside of us. And I know that in my experience with the Fae soul consciousness as a collective, and working with the Faerie as somebody that is not as experienced, or, I don't really do that as a profession. I help people integrate shadow and dream stuff, but Dea is a Faerie doctor. Even when I was coming out of the fog and stuff, they were still very much there. And by they, I mean the elven beings, like the different beings. Like, as long as I was operating in right relationship and mending everything, they were there to support. And a lot of the answers that I needed were all inside me all along. And so, just even maybe today, after you're done listening to this, just do a little journey and kind of be like, how can I connect better to my Fae and express that externally in reality? And you will be surprised at the answers that you receive.
Absolutely. And just remember that the Fae will cut slack and support anyone who sets intentions and are willing to follow through with becoming a equally valuable, creational, kind, and generous member of the whole world. So when I say that, of every aspect of a fairy accord, someone who is relating to nature, the fae, the creatures, and other humans in alignment, and in the right relationship with the creational force that's within us all. So when you're willing to do your part, however small or big that might be, and even if you don't know the outcome, just each day sort of act a little bit closer in harmony with nature, and look at your actions, your thoughts, your experiences, and see if there's any illusionary aspects that you no longer need, that you can let go of. You will get support if you are keen and willing to journey that way. And there are these myths all about the fairy being unforgiving and harsh and cruel, and that is actually not true. Maybe for those who, very keen to destroy everything around them, they might have that experience. But if your intentions are genuine and you're just trying to do the best you can, which will look different to everyone, you will receive support from the fairy folk, whether it's environmental or whether it's about relationships to the creature, the fae, or the human world.
Yeah. And I'm like holding this like willow tree key. So I feel like I want to kind of articulate that willow was like a really good tree for the dreamers, for those that are like dreaming and things like that. She's just a really beautiful tree to work with. And the fae are really it's a really nice aspect, I think. And if you've never explored that side of yourself, just like it's just such a beautiful aspect of the self to empower and express and ground, because that is really the key to having this otherworldly experience that's here. It's not in an escapism. And that's the beauty in this whole like journey, I feel, of like everything that Dea and I are sharing, is when you finally arrive and you realize that maybe everything that you thought was a dream or had to exist on a screen or was a character mask or all these illusions or fantasies can actually be real and equally expressed in our everyday existence. And yeah, I feel like I just kind of like, I feel like it's all warm and fuzzy in this episode, but I feel like I just want to even thank everybody that is expressing, like we just see so much now of the fairy grounded in tangible reality and being expressed so beautifully. And it just like kind of, radiates that ripple effect out. And when you are a visionary, you can kind of zoom out and like see how it might be in 20 years from now, and maybe we actually can heal the earth and it won't be this hard place for us to get to and to land in the body, because it can be quite challenging, as we did say. So go easy on yourself.
Yeah, definitely go easy on yourself. Well, guys, thank you so much for listening to this episode. We are going to be back with the creature one, I think, after this one. And let us know how this landed with you. If you have any questions, you know where to find us. It's all on our channel, all our contact details for both Raven Shadow work and my Fairy Healing Fairy Woman work. You can message us directly via Anchor as well. So feel free to reach out, and thank you so much for listening and watching us. Have a lovely day.